Morning, everybody. Thanks for having me out here. If I'm talking slower than Aleš, it's because I arrived yesterday on a long international plane ride. So my talk is the trouble with risk assessments. In 2014, Eric Holder, the former Attorney General of the United States, gave a speech where he called for a study to be done about risk assessments, these statistical vehicles that are supposed to predict whether or not someone's going to come back to jail at some point in the future because they were picked up on suspicion of a crime, right? And while he lauded the fact that these things have great potential to erase biases in the criminal justice system in the United States, he did point out sort of some of the ideas that Aleš was talking about, which is if we use immutable characteristics like your education level, your socioeconomic background, or neighborhood, there may be issues with the way that these things predict risk, right? Because in the United States, we do have a very segregated society. Intercorrelations with socioeconomic background or even, zip codes could vary largely across different groups. So in the United States, African Americans tend to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, have lower education levels on average, and also live in vastly different places than white folks. So he put out a call that, asked our Sentencing Commission, which is sort of a statistical agency in the United States that looks at biases in sentencing, and he asked them to do a study. They declined, so as investigative journalists, we thought, well, hey, let's check these out. So we looked at a risk assessment called Compass, which was made by a company at the time called Northpoint. Essentially what happens is you get picked up, you spend your night in jail, they ask you 137 questions like, I have never felt sad about things in my life, or, which I don't know anybody who says strongly disagree, I don't think the cops should listen to that, or I am seen by others a cold and not feeling, or perhaps more troublingly, I have friends who have been arrested before, which is a different answer in African American neighborhoods than it's going to be in white neighborhoods. We started looking into them. We talked to the Compass founders very early on. We went to a load of criminology conferences in the United States, both sponsored by the Justice Department and around the country. And we ended up doing a massive round of FOIA requests asking for these scores. Many jurisdictions told us that we can't have those scores because it's proprietary information, because it was made by a private company. But thankfully, Broward County said, if you pay us $10,000, we will give you all the scores. We're a small nonprofit, so we hired a lawyer for $400, and they gave us the scores after the lawyer wrote an angry email. Our initial pass through the data, the way the score works is it gives you, it takes those 137 questions, distills them, runs a regression, and then they bucket the regression output, the likelihood output, into equal deciles, right? So if you look at the African American scores, this is working pretty well if you want to bucket scores into deciles, and that there's about 10% in every single bucket. If you look at the white defendant scores, there's clearly some sort of lower bias going on here, but we haven't corrected for whether or not the score actually predicted anything, right? So this was our initial run. We haven't corrected for risk in this. It could be that all of the white defendants in Broward County, Florida are Mother Teresa, and they deserve a lower score. So we spent 6 months scraping this website, looking for things like previous criminal histories, whether or not they were booked into jail later, afterwards, whether or not they were picked up for another crime, and also what crime they were actually picked up for. Unfortunately, no one can recreate it because afterwards they put the CAPTCHA on it, so sorry guys. But it was interesting, and this is the only time that a criminal justice agent, we asked for all of this jail data in the United States, in Florida. It's the only time in my entire career that a criminal justice agency said, just go ahead and scrape the website. It'll be fine. You don't need to, you don't need permission from us. So we would scrape the website, and the website would go down, and then we call them up, and they'd turn back on the computer. Sort of an interesting sort of side note. So our findings, so once we had collected whether or not folks had gone back to jail so that we could actually correct for whether or not the algorithm was correct, including in other factors, including their age, their gender, what crime they were committed for, to sort of correct those bar charts. We did another round of analysis, which is very simple. The score, what judges see is they see that 1 through 10 score, but they also see, they made it even simpler. It goes low, medium, and high, and they recommend in the manual for this software that anything greater than a medium, anything greater than a 5, is someone who should have more criminal supervision. Now, traditionally in the United States, these scores were used for deciding on parole, deciding who gets out of jail, what sort of services they need, whether or not they need any sort of like drug treatment or increased supervision. When you do it at the end of someone's prison sentence, that's a different question than when you do it before. It's a punitive decision if you get a high score before. By that I mean, if you get a high score, we're maybe not going to let you out after your, let you out to get your life in order for your before your trial. So at bail, what we'll say is, we'll say you're dangerous, you're a flight risk. We think you're going to commit another crime if you get a high score, which means you can't go home and put on a suit, which means that when you get to your trial, if there is a trial, when you get to your trial, you come in the orange pajamas, the uniform of, an inmate, rather than getting to wear a suit. And there have been studies that show that people that don't get bail have worse outcomes in court, because the jury looks at them and says, oh, they're predisposed to assume that this person is a dangerous person because they didn't get bail. So the COMPASS algorithm has been increasingly moved from post-conviction parole decisions to sentencing decisions, which I would argue is an entirely different domain, and they should rework it. But that's an argument we can all sort of hash out among ourselves. So what I want to, so what I want to show you is when we look at all defendants, the positive predictive value is, about 61%. So when it rates someone as dangerous, it's right, in this bucketed situation, 61% of the time. So this is within 2 years, has someone been picked up by the Broward County Sheriffs for another crime. Doesn't matter what it is, outside of traffic tickets. We didn't count traffic tickets. But if you look at the false positive rate for African Americans, when it rates it in this high area, it's wrong. It's wrong 44% of the time. If you compare that to white defendants, when it rates them high, it's wrong only 23% of the time. This is a clear disparity. This is a sort of inversion of the idea of innocent until proven guilty. it means that, in civil terms, that just based on not correcting for anything else, it means that black defendants are incorrectly rated high risk and don't go on to recidivate 2 times more than white defendants. We also ran logistic regression that corrected for things like age. A lot of the African Americans who were in our sample were very young. You know, the number of priors that somebody had committed, so the number of prior crimes, whether or not they committed a misdemeanor or felony, and whether or not they went back on to be picked up for another crime. And what we found is that African Americans were about 45% more likely than, even correcting for all of those things, 45% more likely to get a higher score, controlling for all of these other factors. Now, confusingly, what happened, and I'll get into the reasons why in a little bit, is that when you looked across all races, when you looked at just the straight accuracy, like how often was it correct, we have these survival plots, and they're largely similar. So the algorithm made the correct decision, but it got to it in very, very different ways, right? It got to it by over-predicting black recidivism and under-predicting white recidivism, which makes sense because in the United States, African Americans recidivate, are picked up for future crimes far more often than white Americans. So it was picking up on something in those 137 questions that was correlated with race. What was not largely discussed, and we didn't make a whole lot of a huge amount of hay about this, is that when you look at the male-female divide, you'll see that a high-risk woman, so someone who is rated high risk after 2 years, had the same amount of accuracy as a medium risk man. So this is bias in the accuracy rates. So if you're a woman and you were rated high risk, you're really only as dangerous, you're only about 50% likely to, after 2 years, recidivate, which is a clear example of the traditional sort of sense of bias. And what happens, we went to the company, we asked them about this, and they were like, yeah, it's a known problem. We have a plugin to our software where you can fix this, but Broward County didn't buy it. So, and because we're journalists, you know, that's all great, you know, and fun to point out, but we also have to point out the human cost of this. So we spent a long time knocking on doors in Broward County, Florida, talking to folks who had been picked up before. This guy, Vernon Prater, he was slightly older than Brescia Borden on the right, but he had 2 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery. And the algorithm rated him a 3. Afterwards, he got out of jail and he went and stole, I think, $20,000 worth of electronics from an electronics store, and went back to jail. Brescia Borden, she had 4 juvenile misdemeanors. She was picked up because she was being a teenager, and she was walking around her neighborhood, and she picked up a bike on the sidewalk and started riding it. The mother of the kid, you know, came out and said, hey, give it back. Brescia gave it back, and Brescia gave it back, but by that time the neighbor had called the cops on her. She is, you know, currently getting her GED. She is apparently very, very dangerous, which probably has to do with the fact that, you know, the bias in the correlations between African American, but also because she's a woman, like I showed earlier, and that she's younger than Vernon Prater. So all of those factors are together. The response to this story, we did a number of stories in this series. We've been working on this series, Machine Bias, for a long time. Last year, we did a bunch on Facebook political ads. We did a bunch on digital algorithms like Amazon and stuff like that. We also did a similar story based on car insurance, which I thought was going to be the more popular story because it affects everybody and not just people who have run-ins with law enforcement. But the response to this particular story was gigantic and through the roof. There were a number of papers. It started an ethical debate among people, not just within criminal justice, but also how we catalog algorithms and the output of algorithms. So before this story, the ways in which people you know, sort of rate and rank algorithms was solely based on this idea of accuracy. How accurate is it? Don't ask questions about how it gets to that accuracy. Don't ask whether or not it has a false positive rate. You know, what types of errors it makes and what those errors actually mean. And since then, there's been a series of posts saying of articles saying we're wrong. There's been a series of articles saying, well, let's define what fairness means. Let's look at the problem domain, that sort of stuff. The company put up a 53-page white paper on their website that unfortunately you can no longer find because they had to change their name over this, and they took down that white paper. Criminologists sort of wrote a bunch of blog posts about, wrote a bunch of articles about how we didn't really know what we were talking about. People investigating the impacts of AI wrote a bunch of posts about how we do really know what we were talking about, and it's a debate that still goes on to this day. So I'm going to cover a couple of the more interesting papers that came out after that. Earlier this year, Julia Dressel and Farid, they decided to look not necessarily at the false positive rate, but at this question, false positives, false negatives, and the debate over accuracy and error rates. But whether it was any better, this question that it's just math, so it's got to be better than biased judges, especially in the South, right? And so what they did is they asked a bunch of people on Mechanical Turk to look just at, a person's age. I think it was just at the crime that they committed when they were picked up, or the crime that they were picked up for, right? Because it's pre-trial, and the number of priors. And by using that very simple algorithm and surveying, I don't know what their size was, but surveying a number of people on Mechanical Turk and just asking them to find out if this person would come back, they, instead of using 137 questions or 137 factors, they were able to, those untrained non-criminal justice professionals were as accurate as using Compass with its 137 questions. They also were able to look at just 2 factors, right? So they made a simple linear predictor of 1 to 10. They ran a regression, and they had the same exact accuracy as this software that asked 137 questions. Those 2 predictors, that regression just, I think, had whether or not you committed a misdemeanor or felony and your number of prior offenses. So it was really sort of fascinating. And, a lot of the debate around algorithms has been, it's just math, it can't be biased at all. And surely it will erase some of the bias in human decision-making. But as Alice pointed out, we want compassion in our decision-making. Yes, sure, there are judges out there that are biased based on how people look, but we also want the nuance when we're talking about a criminal justice sort of situation that these algorithms are not necessarily going to have. Regarding the truth tables at the beginning, there's a bunch, a couple of MacArthur Genius grantees looked at this question of accuracy versus fairness, versus false positive rates. So the idea that, a score can be accurate, but have this seeming unfairness in the way that it gets to that accuracy. Can overpredict African Americans, be wrong, have the same accuracy when it underpredicts white folks. And what they found, and there's fancy math, and it delves really deeply into probability theory. They also talk about NP completeness and everything like that, but it's a good read, and you should get your graph paper out and work through the issues in it. But what they found is there's no way to solve this problem if you have a score that outputs dangerous or not. You're always, if two groups have different underlying base rates, you're always going to run into this issue, which puts a real sort of like moral question on the use of these algorithms, right? Scientifically, we're always going to overpredict the more dangerous or the more exposed group, and we're always going to underpredict the less exposed group. And that has serious problems when you're doing something for sentencing or has punitive outcomes at the end. If it has outcomes that deal with more services, right, like the debate over parole, then you could make the argument that this is a corrective force. If you do it after parole and you're offering services based on a higher score, this could be a corrective. If you're doing it before sentencing, and you're always going to have these problems if you have a binary classifier like this, then you're just exacerbating things like over-policing and over-incarceration, but doing it under the guise of it's just math. And then finally, the last point that I'd like to point out is the Wisconsin Supreme Court looked at the use of this algorithm in this famous case, Wisconsin v. Loomis, or famous to me. I don't know if it's famous to you guys, because I follow all of this stuff. And sort of looked at the issues from a legal perspective about these things. They did not reverse. Loomis got scored by Compass. Originally, his original deal was very good. The Compass score came back and said he was going to be very dangerous, and he got an increased sentence because they use it in Wisconsin every step of the way. And so he fought it all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't reverse the decision, but they did say something very interesting, which is these risk assessments, sort of echoing Eric Holder, can be dangerous when you view them as dangerous, not as decisions based on this person is a high risk of recidivating versus this person is not, is totally safe. So if you view them as binary things, they're going to have low accuracy. They're going to have low accuracy. They're going to have these systematic problems. But if you do something that judges are not usually used to, right? A judge decides guilty, not guilty, thinks in binary. If you do something that judges are not used to, which is you treat these as a likelihood that this is going to happen, or an increased likelihood, and you have a little bit of nuance with the way that you interpret those scores, which is not, nuance is not the domain of criminal justice in general. But if you can start thinking of them that way and take other factors into account, maybe these things are not sort of as dangerous. So they recommended to everybody who's using these scores a sort of warning label, a disclosure that this is a likelihood. This is something that you should take other information into, and that also that it's going to be right wherever you set your threshold for this person is dangerous, disclosing how often, what the chance is that this is right. If you set it at 5, you know, if you set your decision threshold back here at 5, and a score anything higher than 5 is someone who's dangerous, you're only going to be right 61% of the time. But if you set your decision threshold at 9, then you'll be right like something like 80% of the time. So allowing judges to know what goes into this score was something that was very important in Wisconsin. That's a pretty quick overview. Wondering if anybody has any questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Testing?
There's also one of these. Okay.
I think it's going now.
Okay, good.
Sorry. Is there a way to do a baseline comparison? Is there a way to do a baseline comparison to see what the bias was in human judge sentencing and compare that to how the bias worked in the algorithm?
So that's the reason why I pulled this up. The problem with doing judges writ large, and there's a number of people like in the United States trying to do that, and like Measures for Justice and stuff. The problem with doing judges writ large is every single county, every single jurisdiction has different ideas on what exactly is recidivism, right? So, so figuring out the underlying biases, either it would be a very small study that had one jurisdiction, or it would be this gigantic, huge undertaking that unfortunately, like the Sentencing Commission is not really, is sort of involved in that work, but is not really like a statistical arm. And in fact, in the past, they have said we can't do studies like these specifically for those reasons. After we reported our story, 538 did a great rundown. I think there's been a bunch of research since then on trying to understand whether or not it's better than judges. But 538, which is a data journalism outfit in the United States, did a great rundown of all of the studies and how they weren't really applicable to this idea of let's quantify the bias in human judges and see if it's worse than algorithms. So the long and short of it is there's no answer, right? In general, criminal justice statistics in the United States are few and far between and lacking and dirty and everything like that. So the answer is unfortunately no. There's another one back here.
We have time for another question. Yeah, sorry. Carla, the lady was first.
Okay.
Thank you. I have a question with regard to the Kleinberg.
Yes.
Because if we always overpredict the more risky and underpredict the less risky, that doesn't explain the gender gap.
No. Well, we didn't. This is just based on the black-white thing. The gender is a true failing of the algorithm. So the gender thing is that the algorithm really is traditionally biased. They were just looking at different base rates, assuming that they have the same. If you assume that they have the same accuracy, then the base rate problem is always going to show up. If you assume that they have different accuracy, then all bets are off. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay, one short question and then
One short question.
Yeah, well, I have a question about the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the Loomis case and the warning tags. I think they're a great thing and a great start, but I think we have to question how effective they might actually be. The Supreme Court has a lot of confidence in that judges will disregard risk scores if they have inconsistent, if they're inconsistent with their other factors. And I think that might be an overconfidence because, I mean, humans have been shown to generally overtrust in numbers that have been generated by a computer, automation bias. And I think it would be really interesting to do studies on that, how they might now react differently after they're required to have these warning tags with the compass numbers.
Yeah, this is something that we're definitely sort of like looking into at the moment to see if like these warning signals actually work. But you know, just doing this part, you know, took us a year. So like, stay tuned.
Looking forward.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Right, thanks.
Jeff, I invite everyone for a final round of applause.